Another of the government's key goals is its net debt target. We've set a target of reducing net debt as a proportion of GDP to about 20% by 2020. And that's about resilience. And this is where I look at Thomas's video and think, gosh, has he been reading this part of the speech? Resilience has become a buzzword in this country in recent times, and it's an important word. Recent earthquakes and flood events have placed emphasis on the importance of resilient buildings, resilient infrastructure, and resilient communities. But the most important resilience we need to have is to be a resilient country. A country that has the ability and the capacity to respond to the needs of our most vulnerable people and communities in the face of a natural disaster. And we have direct experience over the last 8 years of how important that capacity is. When the GFC hit, the economic fortunes of the world plunged, and New Zealand with it. The combination of the previous government spending, which was a 50% increase in 5 years, and the impact of the global financial crisis meant that we were faced as a new government with Treasury's prognosis of a decade of deficits and net debt climbing to 60% of GDP. We took the decision to support the most vulnerable New Zealanders through the GFC and started to rein in some of the more wild spending plans of the previous government. Then New Zealand had the second big shock, the Canterbury earthquakes. These two major events meant we had to borrow very significant sums of money. Net debt grew rapidly. We expected it to peak at 30% of GDP. It peaked at 26%. The deficit grew. It reached $18 billion in 1 year. I remember Bill telling us that number. And we're going, whoa. The important point is that to manage New Zealand through those two shocks meant borrowing the equivalent of about 20% of our GDP. That was the right thing to do. It allowed us to spread the cost of both events and allow the economy to recover without extra taxes or slashing entitlements. And I remember critics on the left and the right were calling for various versions of those approaches back then. But now it's the time to get that debt down and make sure we have the capacity to absorb and respond to the next challenge we face. There will always be future shocks. We are a geologically young country. And we are also, I feel like a geologically young country. We are also a small country in an often turbulent world. So there are plenty of bumps in the road ahead of us, whether they be from natural disasters or from international events. The Kaikoura earthquake was tough for Kaikoura, for Waiau and for Seddon, but it would have been much tougher for New Zealand if it had been centred a bit further north in this city. So it's important we start now to save for our next rainy day. The most important protection against future shocks is to run a strong and vibrant economy, but lowering debt levels gives us the capacity to respond. That's why the government set the target to reduce debt to around 20% of GDP by 2020. We're determined to maintain the progress to that target in this budget. But in Budget 2017, the government will also set a new medium-term fiscal target of getting net debt down to between 10 and 15% of GDP in another 5 years, by the middle of next decade. At 10 to 15%, New Zealand will have the capacity to absorb not just one, but a couple of big shocks at once, if we need to, as we did last time. And that's what resilience is all about. And I believe we owe it to our future to take that decision. And we'll be able to do it while making the level of capital investment that I talked about earlier.